The morning of February 23, 1945 brought no relief to the pulverized landscape of Iwo Jima. The island was a volcanic anomaly, a pork chop-shaped protrusion of black basalt and sulfur rising from the depths of the Pacific Ocean. It was an environment that seemed actively hostile to human life even before the implementation of industrial warfare. The stench of rotten eggs from natural sulfur vents permeated the humid air, mixing with the dense, choking cordite smoke and the sickly sweet odor of decomposing flesh. The United States Marine Corps had landed on the beaches 4 days prior, anticipating a brutal but swift operation. Instead, they found themselves locked in a subterranean meat grinder meticulously designed by Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. Kuribayashi, an officer who had studied cavalry tactics in the United States and intimately understood American military doctrine, completely abandoned the traditional Japanese strategy of defending the water's edge. He recognized that the overwhelming naval gunfire from the American Fifth Fleet would instantly annihilate any forces exposed on the beaches. Instead, he directed his engineers to construct an interlocking network of over 1,500 subterranean pillboxes, blockhouses, and connecting tunnels deep within the volcanic rock. The island itself was transformed into a continuous fortress of reinforced concrete and black ash designed to bleed the American forces for every single yard of advance. The primary objective for the Marines on the northern end of the island was Motoyama Airfield No. 2, a vast expanse of flattened volcanic ash that represented a dagger pointed directly at the Japanese home islands. The approach to the airfield was guarded by a series of mutually supporting pillboxes positioned to create devastating crossfires over the open ground. American tanks attempting to push forward were disabled by buried mines or targeted by 47mm anti-tank guns hidden behind heavy steel doors that only opened to fire before sliding shut against the rock. The infantry of the 1st Battalion 21st Marine Regiment 3rd Marine Division found themselves completely pinned down in the black sand, unable to advance a single foot without drawing a concentrated storm of heavy machine gun fire from unseen apertures. The standard weapons of the Marine Rifle Squad, the M1 Garand, the Browning automatic rifle, the fragmentation grenade, were entirely useless against these hardened concrete structures. Artillery fire and naval bombardments simply bounced off the thick roofs or were absorbed by the deep layers of volcanic ash piled atop the bunkers. The only tactical solution, the only weapon capable of breaking the stalemate, was the flamethrower. Corporal Herschel Woodrow Williams, a 21-year-old from a dairy farm in West Virginia, was one of the few surviving flamethrower operators in his battalion. The life expectancy of a flamethrower operator on Iwo Jima was measured in minutes. They were the highest priority targets for Japanese snipers and machine gunners. The tactical vulnerability of the operator was absolute. To deploy his weapon, the operator had to stand up, expose himself to enemy fire, and close the distance to within 20 or 30 yards of the target. He had to do this while carrying a 70-pound mechanical bomb on his back. The weapon Williams carried was the M2 two-man portable flamethrower, a piece of equipment that was both a marvel of chemical engineering and a terrifying liability. The apparatus consisted of 3 cylindrical steel tanks mounted on an uncomfortable canvas harness. The 2 outer tanks held approximately 4 gallons of thickened fuel, while the central tank contained compressed nitrogen gas pressurized to 2,000 pounds per square inch. The fuel was not raw gasoline, which would burn too quickly and dissipate in the air. Instead, it was napalm, a highly volatile mixture developed by scientists at Harvard University utilizing naphthenic and palmitic acids to create a gelatinous sticky compound. This gelled gasoline adhered to any surface it struck and burned at an astonishing 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The operator controlled the weapon via heavy rubber hose connected to a steel wand which housed a dual trigger mechanism. The rear trigger released the pressurized fuel while the front trigger ignited a pyrotechnic match at the nozzle. When the operator squeezed both triggers, the nitrogen blasted the gelled fuel through the ignition flame, projecting a continuous rod of liquid fire across the battlefield. But the mechanical limitations were severe. The operator had exactly enough fuel for roughly 7 to 10 seconds of continuous fire. Once the tanks were empty, he was completely defenseless, weighed down by 70 pounds of dead steel in the middle of a kill zone. When the commanding officer of the 1st Battalion called for the flamethrower, Williams was the only man available. The other operators had either been killed, wounded, or evacuated due to combat fatigue. The situation in front of Airfield No. 2 was critical. The network of Japanese pillboxes had completely halted the Marine advance. Williams gathered his equipment, securing the heavy harness over his combat utility uniform. The temperature on the island was already sweltering, and the physical exertion of moving through the deep, loose volcanic ash with the heavy tanks was agonizing. The black sand of Iwo Jima is often described as feeling like coffee grounds. It provided no traction, absorbing the kinetic energy of every step and dragging the men downward. Williams was assigned 4 riflemen to provide covering fire. Their job was to shoot at the tiny rectangular firing slits of the concrete bunkers, forcing the Japanese machine gunners to flinch or seek cover just long enough for Williams to maneuver into range. The operation relied entirely on this synchronized covering fire. If the rifleman failed to suppress the bunker, Williams would be cut down before he ever pulled the trigger on his wand. Williams began his solitary advance, crawling on his stomach through the black sand, dragging the heavy tanks behind him. The air was thick with flying steel. Japanese machine gun rounds snapped overhead, tearing through the sparse vegetation and kicking up geysers of sharp ash. The noise of the battlefield was a continuous, deafening roar of artillery detonations, mortar strikes, and the rhythmic hammering of heavy weapons. Williams isolated a single pillbox, focusing his entire being on the narrow horizontal slit, pouring tracer fire into the Marine lines. He waited for his covering team to open up with their Garens and automatic rifles. As the American rounds pinged off the concrete and struck the sandbags surrounding the aperture, Williams surged to his feet. He ran through the chaotic crossfire, his boots slipping in the ash, closing the agonizing distance. The effective range of the M2-2 was practically 30 yards. He had to get close enough to ensure the stream of napalm entered the slit directly. If he fired too early, the wind coming off the ocean could dissipate the flame, or the sticky fuel could splash harmlessly against the exterior concrete. When he judged the distance to be correct, he braced his legs against the recoil of the pressurized tanks. He aimed the heavy steel wand directly at the dark rectangular opening of the pillbox and squeezed the triggers. The ignition of the flamethrower is a violently concussive event. The pyrotechnic charge flares, and the compressed nitrogen forces the gelled fuel out at immense pressure. A roaring column of liquid fire erupted from the nozzle, crossing the distance in a fraction of a second and pouring directly into the aperture of the bunker. The physical effects of a flamethrower attack against a fortified structure are absolute and horrific. It is not merely the thermal energy that kills. When the burning napalm enters the confined space of a concrete pillbox, it instantaneously consumes all available oxygen in the immediate vicinity. The massive sudden combustion creates a vacuum effect, drawing air violently from the surrounding tunnels and vents. Simultaneously, the burning fuel produces immense volumes of lethal carbon monoxide and thick, suffocating smoke. The Japanese defenders inside the bunker were subjected to temperatures that instantly vaporized human tissue and melted the steel barrels of their weapons. Those who were not immediately incinerated by the direct contact with the gelled fuel died within seconds from absolute oxygen starvation or inhalation of the superheated toxic gases. The flame completely neutralized the position, permanently silencing the machine gun that had pinned down the battalion. But Williams did not have time to celebrate the destruction of the first pillbox. The tactical reality of the Japanese defense network meant that as soon as one position was destroyed, the neighboring pillboxes immediately shifted their fire to the exposed operator. The unburned fuel leaking from the nozzle of his wand and the residual smoke marked his position clearly to every Japanese soldier in the sector. He dropped back into the black sand, crawling frantically away from the burning structure to avoid the incoming mortar fire that the Japanese quickly called down upon his location. The physical toll of the operation was enormous. The 70-pound weight on his back, the extreme heat of the environment, the sheer terror of the continuous crossfire, and the inhalation of sulfur and cordite were pushing his body toward total exhaustion. Furthermore, he was rapidly depleting his fuel supply. He signaled to the rear and sprinted back to the American lines to swap his empty tanks for a fresh set brought forward by the supply elements. This logistical resupply under fire was incredibly dangerous. The Japanese artillery observers constantly scanned the rear areas for any concentration of troops or equipment. Williams hastily strapped on the new tanks, checked the pressure valves, and returned to the front line, selecting his next target in the interlocking defensive web. Over the course of 4 grueling hours, Williams systematically dismantled the Japanese strongpoint. He crawled through the pulverized terrain, utilizing shallow craters, and destroyed American vehicles for micro-concealment. He coordinated with his 4 riflemen, directing their fire against the specific apertures he needed suppressed. He destroyed a second pillbox, then a third, then a fourth. The process was a repetitive mechanical exercise in localized annihilation. Each successful attack required him to expose himself entirely to the enemy, relying on luck and the suppressing fire of his comrades to survive the critical seconds it took to close the distance. The psychological strain of this solitary mission was profound. He was operating completely independently, the sole deciding factor in the life or death of the men pinned down behind him. He witnessed the horrific reality of the weapon he wielded, the smell of burning flesh, the muffled screams from inside the concrete tombs, the sheer absolute devastation of the napalm. But the combat environment demanded emotional detachment. He had to focus entirely on the mechanics of the weapon, the pressure gauges, the wind direction, the angles of the concrete. It was during his assault on one of the final pillboxes in the network that the most desperate and terrifying close-quarters engagement occurred. Williams had maneuvered into a flanking position, preparing to direct his flame into a ventilation shaft on the roof of a bunker. He was completely focused on the structure, his vision narrowed to the specific target. He had moved out of the direct line of sight of his covering riflemen, isolating himself in the chaotic terrain of pulverized rock and shattered concrete. The Japanese defenders, deeply entrenched in their subterranean tunnels, were intimately aware of the catastrophic threat posed by the American flamethrowers. General Kuribayashi had issued explicit orders to eliminate the operators at all costs, utilizing any means necessary. A group of Japanese infantrymen hidden within a connecting trench adjacent to the pillbox realized that the American was setting up for a strike on the ventilation shaft. They knew that if he fired, the men inside the bunker would be incinerated. In a desperate, fanatical attempt to save the position, 3 Japanese soldiers erupted from the concealed trench, completely surprising the lone Marine. The 3 soldiers executed a banzai charge and organized rapid assault, relying on shock and extreme close-quarters violence. They were armed with the Arisaka Type 99 rifle, a bolt-action weapon chambered in 7.7 mm. But more importantly, they had fixed their Type 30 bayonets. The Type 30 bayonet was a terrifying weapon featuring a blade over 15 inches long, designed for deep penetrating thrusts. The Japanese Imperial Army placed an immense cultural and tactical emphasis on bayonet fighting, known as Jukin Jutsu. They believed that the spiritual purity and aggressive spirit of the infantrymen were best expressed through the cold steel of the bayonet. The 3 soldiers charged across the uneven volcanic ash, their faces contorted, screaming their battle cries, closing the distance to Williams with terrifying speed. The tactical geometry of the situation was heavily weighted against the Marine. The M2-2 flamethrower was a heavy, cumbersome area denial weapon not designed for rapid reaction against fast-moving point targets. Williams was burdened by the 70-pound tanks, his mobility severely restricted. He could not run, he could not dodge, he could not easily pivot to face the multiple threats closing in from his flank. The human reaction time in extreme combat is measured in fractions of a second. As the 3 Japanese soldiers charged with their bayonets lowered, aimed directly at his chest and abdomen, Williams did not panic. The rigorous training of the Marine Corps and the sheer instinct for survival took over. He recognized immediately that he could not unholster his sidearm or attempt to evade the thrusts. His only available weapon was the heavy steel wand in his hands. He swung the nozzle of the flamethrower toward the charging soldiers. They were incredibly close, perhaps within 15 or 20 feet, entirely inside the lethal envelope of the weapon. Williams braced his stance against the shifting volcanic sand and squeezed both the rear and front triggers simultaneously. The mechanical valves opened, the pyrotechnic match flared, and the compressed nitrogen drove the gelled napalm out of the nozzle. The ignition was instantaneous. A roaring, concentrated rod of liquid fire slammed directly into the charging Japanese soldiers. The effect was absolute and immediate. The 3 men were caught perfectly in the center of the thermal stream. The burning napalm, acting with its adhesive properties, coated their uniforms, their weapons, and their flesh. The physical reality of a direct hit from a military flamethrower is instantaneous incapacitation. The temperature of the burning gel exceeds 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, causing immediate catastrophic thermal shock to the human nervous system. The intense heat instantly vaporizes the moisture on the surface of the skin and eyes, blinding the targets and completely destroying the neuromuscular pathways required for coordinated movement. The kinetic energy of the pressurized fuel, combined with the violent sudden shock of the incineration, completely broke the momentum of their charge. The 3 soldiers who had been sprinting forward with lethal intent just a second prior were instantly transformed into human torches, collapsing into the black volcanic sand. The entire engagement, from the moment the Japanese soldiers broke cover to the moment the flamethrower extinguished their charge, lasted exactly 7 seconds. 7 seconds of continuous pressurized fire that consumed the fuel in Williams' tanks and permanently neutralized the immediate threat. The sheer mechanical lethality of the weapon had saved his life against overwhelming odds. The air in the immediate vicinity was completely devoid of oxygen, replaced by the thick, choking black smoke of the burning napalm and the horrific smell of incinerated human tissue. Williams released the triggers, the roar of the weapon cutting off abruptly, leaving only the crackling sound of the burning fuel on the ground and the distant continuous thunder of the island-wide battle. He stood there for a brief moment, the heavy tanks pulling on his exhausted shoulders, the adrenaline surging through his system, processing the incredible violence that had just occurred. He had narrowly avoided being skewered by 3 heavy steel blades, surviving solely due to the raw, unmitigated destructive power of the chemical weapon he wielded. But the battle for Airfield No. 2 was not over. The pillbox that the 3 soldiers had been attempting to defend remained active. Williams, realizing his tanks were completely empty, was once again a defenseless liability on the battlefield. He had to navigate his way back through the jagged terrain under the constant threat of sniper fire to reach the supply point. The physical exhaustion was compounding. His uniform was soaked in sweat and coated in the abrasive volcanic dust. His hands were blistered from the heat of the flamethrower wand. Yet the tactical situation demanded that the pillbox be destroyed to allow the battalion to advance. He reached the rear lines, unbuckled the empty harness, and strapped on yet another set of fully loaded tanks. He checked the pressure gauges, ensured the pyrotechnic matches were loaded, and began the agonizing crawl back to the front lines. The entire process of locating, targeting, approaching, and destroying the Japanese fortifications was a repetitive cycle of extreme trauma and physical exertion. Throughout that single afternoon, Corporal Herschel Woodrow Williams returned to the rear for fresh fuel tanks 5 separate times. He repeatedly exposed himself to the concentrated fire of an entrenched, fanatical enemy. He navigated the treacherous terrain of Iwo Jima, where every crater and ridge could conceal a hidden sniper or a spider hole. He pushed his physical and mental endurance far beyond the normal limits of human capability. By the end of the day, he had single-handedly destroyed 7 distinct Japanese pillboxes, completely shattering the defensive network that had stalled the advance of his battalion. He had eliminated the mutually supporting machine gun nests, clearing a path through the volcanic ash and allowing the infantry to finally push forward and secure the approaches to Motoyama Airfield No. 2. His actions were directly responsible for breaking the stalemate in his sector and saving the lives of countless Marines who would have otherwise been forced to assault the hardened concrete structures with inadequate weaponry. The strategic importance of securing Iwo Jima cannot be overstated. The island was positioned directly along the flight path of the American B-29 Superfortress bombers flying from the Marianas Islands to conduct the strategic bombing campaign against the Japanese home islands. The Japanese radar station on Iwo Jima provided early warning to Tokyo, allowing Japanese fighter interceptors to organize and attack the incoming bomber formations. Furthermore, damaged American bombers returning from the raids desperately needed an emergency landing strip. Without Iwo Jima, hundreds of damaged aircraft and their 10-man crews would have been forced to ditch in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The capture of the airfields on Iwo Jima was the primary objective of the entire bloody campaign, an objective that was achieved through the unimaginable sacrifice and brutal close-quarters combat executed by men like Woody Williams. The black volcanic sand of the island absorbed the blood of nearly 7,000 American dead and over 20,000 Japanese defenders, a staggering butcher's bill for an island barely 8 square miles in size. The story of the flamethrower operator on Iwo Jima is a stark, unvarnished representation of the sheer industrial brutality of the Second World War. The development of weapons like the M2-2 napalm flamethrower reflects a dark truth about the nature of total war, where scientific innovation is entirely dedicated to the efficient maximization of human destruction. The flamethrower was a weapon of terror, a psychological and physical tool designed specifically to eradicate human life in the most agonizing manner possible. The men who carried these weapons were burdened not just by the immense physical weight of the steel tanks but by the profound psychological weight of the devastation they inflicted. They were forced to witness the reality of their actions up close, seeing the horrific results of the burning gel. They were ordinary young men pulled from farms, factories, and high schools across America and thrust into a prehistoric nightmare where their only purpose was the systematic extermination of another group of human beings deeply entrenched in the rock. The engagement where Williams incinerated the 3 charging Japanese soldiers highlights the desperate primal nature of the fighting on Iwo Jima. The Japanese forces, knowing they were entirely cut off from resupply or reinforcement and understanding that their ultimate fate was death, fought with a fatalistic fanaticism that is difficult to comprehend. The banzai charge, an act of suicidal aggression, was a tactical reality that the American forces faced repeatedly. It was a clash of two entirely different paradigms of warfare: the American reliance on overwhelming mechanical firepower and technological superiority versus the Japanese reliance on spiritual fortitude and extreme self-sacrifice. In that 7-second encounter, the overwhelming power of the American chemical weapon decisively crushed the human spirit and the cold steel of the bayonet charge. It was a micro-level demonstration of the macro-level reality of the entire Pacific conflict, the inevitable triumph of industrial might over fanatical resistance. Following the Battle of Iwo Jima, Corporal Herschel Woodrow Williams was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration awarded by the United States government. The citation meticulously details his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. It describes his solitary advance, his repeated returns for fresh fuel tanks, and the specific incident where he was threatened by riflemen who attempted to stop him with bayonets and he killed them with a burst of flame from his weapon. The medal was presented to him by President Harry S. Truman at the White House, a stark contrast to the sulphurous stinking ash of the island where the actions were performed. But the true legacy of Woody Williams and the men who fought alongside him is not found in the bronze and ribbons of military awards. It is found in the undeniable historical reality of their survival and the brutal and compromising work they performed in the face of absolute horror. The men who survived the campaign returned home carrying the invisible scars of their experience. The memory of the black sand, the smell of the sulfur, the deafening noise, and the terrifying reality of the combat environment stayed with them for the rest of their lives. The flamethrower operators in particular faced a unique psychological burden, grappling with the specific nature of the weapon they used. They had acted as the executioners, breaking the defensive lines when no other weapon could succeed, but the cost of that success was etched permanently into their minds. The history of the Second World War is often presented through grand strategic maps, moving front lines, and the decisions of generals. But the actual war was fought by the infantryman, the Marine in the dirt, the 21-year-old boy carrying a 70-pound bomb on his back, crawling through the pulverized rock to incinerate another human being in a concrete box. This is the unyielding factual reality of the conflict. The preservation of this history requires absolute accuracy and a commitment to detailing the micro-realities of the combat experience. We must understand the exact mechanics of the M2-2 flamethrower, the specific chemical composition of the napalm, and the precise tactical situation that forced a lone Marine to advance against a fortified bunker network. We must acknowledge the fanatical courage of the Japanese defenders who charged a weapon of absolute destruction with nothing but bayonets. We must document the specific 7 seconds of violence that decided the fate of 4 men on that volcanic ridge. By adhering strictly to the verified historical data, we strip away the romanticized notions of warfare and expose the raw mechanical brutality of the event. It is only through this unflinching examination of the facts that we can truly comprehend the magnitude of the sacrifice and the profound, terrifying reality of what the human race is capable of when pushed to the absolute extremes of industrial conflict. The story of Woody Williams on Iwo Jima is a testament to extraordinary individual courage deployed within an environment of unimaginable horror, a permanent, enduring record of the violent crucible that forged the modern world.